The major parties continue their housing policy promo tour. Another foreign bombshell disrupts the campaign with reports of Russian activity in Indonesia. I'm Patricia Karvelas, live from the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne. Welcome to Afternoon Briefing. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has admitted he would help his children with a housing deposit a day after his son Harry joined his press conference to say he was struggling to get into the market. He says he doesn't want the bank of mum and dad to be the only option for first home buyers. The Prime Minister, meanwhile, says he won't release Treasury modelling on his new housing policy. Who is winning the housing policy battle? I'll ask my political panel. Independent MP Monique Ryan says she now believes influencer content paid for by politicians should be clearly labelled, despite telling insiders she had no opinion on the issue. The ABC revealed last week Independent MP Allegra Spender had paid for influencer posts, which in most cases were authorised under electoral guidelines, but not initially marked as paid for. I'll speak to podcaster and influencer Glenn James later this hour, who has also been asked to collaborate. And Defence Minister Richard Marles says Australia has been in contact with Indonesia about reports Russia wants to base aircraft at a military airport in the province of Papua, just 1,300 kilometres away from Australian mainland. Is Indonesia strengthening ties with Russia? I'll speak to the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, live this hour. If you think back to the federal budget, it was only a few weeks ago, there was much consternation in the press gallery about the Labor Party paying for influencers to travel to Canberra to join in the budget lockup. Glenn James is a finance podcaster and was one of those influencers. He says he has now resolved not to interview politicians during the election cycle. I spoke to him a short time ago. Glenn, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You were one of the so-called influencers that the Labor Party paid the travel costs to the budget just before the election. Just firstly, explain that process to us, because we hear a lot about influencers, but here on traditional television, I don't think people understand the process. Just talk me through it.
Yeah, so first and foremost, I don't see myself as an influencer. I run a money podcast and I've done that for over 7 years now. And for me, just on a human level, I love watching the budget. I'm a political nerd. I love all that. And when I got an email to go to the federal budget lockup, it was for me like a bucket list thing. Like, yeah, I get to go to the lockup. And I was in, like, before I knew any of the details. I'm like, yep, count me in, coach. And then they said, oh, we can pay for your accommodation and your airfares. And I said, awesome, I'm at the Midnight Canberra. And they said, no, we'll put you in a hotel. But it was, look, I was there anyway. I did some content there just because I run a money podcast. It's a money thing. And I think it was a weird thing this year, PK, because it was the budget that kind of wasn't going to happen and shouldn't have happened like at the time, right? And so I would have done it outside of the election cycle. But look, I did content there. There was amazing access to the ministers, but I did disclose to my audience that I had my accommodation and airfare paid. Like, I didn't say, all right, well, he was Newcastle Airport car park, he was the Uber. Like, it wasn't that micro, and I would have went myself. But if someone's paying for me, whatever, I'll take it.
Yeah. And I think the transparency is the key thing. Just talk to me about how you've thought about it since, though. I understand you won't interview politicians during an election cycle. Why is that?
Yeah, so that decision literally I made over the last week. I listened to some political podcasts in the US and, you know, the whole Trump election thing, and particularly on Rogan, because I also thought that I'm just a guy doing my podcast from Newcastle. I can chat to people, but the thing is, whether you're Joe Rogan or not, or a small podcast like mine, you do have influence. And I think if you have public influence, I believe we do have some type of responsibility. So that kind of literally just in the last week dawned on me that I'm actually not, I'll interview any politician out of election cycle. And I've interviewed Allegra before. I've interviewed various ministers before, but something doesn't sit right with me to be able to put the pressure on someone like you can, because you're in that every day. I think inherently my listeners, the Money, Money, Money podcast, it is an opinion piece of Glenn James. Like, this is me. This is a microphone. I'm not owned by anyone. I own my podcast. I do what I want. I'm independent. I don't have a responsibility to be impartial. But I think it's just dawned on me that there are better people that can actually put the fire onto people with actual policy details, and I'm probably not that guy.
Well, it's funny you describe it that way. I think sometimes for politicians, they quite like that it's not the fire, right? That's why they want to do it.
I think, look, and this is the dance that I've played with all around, right? Like, as a leader, like, I want to know the personality, like what's someone like, just as a regular person, and that does matter, absolutely. But I just think in my lane, I will just keep away from that. I've literally told people, it's like, hey, I don't care who you vote for. I'll never be one of those influencers that are like, we've got to keep Dutton out, or we've got to get Albo out. Like, I don't care. I just say, please vote for a party or a person that you think will help people worse off than you. Whatever that looks like in your world.
Yeah, that's so I think you think about it probably differently to others. So in terms of the rules around this, do you think we've got the disclosures wrong? Do politicians need to be more transparent? You may have been when you were paid, the flights were paid for, but do you think there needs to be more transparency around this?
Look, there probably does, but this is the old case of technology moving faster than legislation, right? Like, we've seen it everywhere. Maybe podcasts might come in under a national communications code like radio. I don't know. I hope not. I don't like rules. But I just think a reasonable person, if they're getting paid to have flights, or if you've been approached by a candidate to say, hey, do you want to work together? And there is money. I come from a financial advice background, and in my world, disclosure is everything. And, there could be conflicts. We just have to disclose them, and then the listener can take that as they will.
You've also been contacted by Allegra's Spenders team for a collaboration. Can you tell me about that contact?
Yeah, it was a contact. From what it appeared to be, it seemed like a third-party PR company.
And she confirmed, to be clear to me, I think it was last week on this show, that that's what she's done. She's paid a third party to then approach people like you. So, yeah, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So I was approached, hey, would you like to collaborate with us? We want to partner with people who share the same vision and values and yada, yada, yada. And that's all good. But I just thought, and I'm probably, pragmatic to a detriment, I've got a national audience. I don't know if it is worth talking to one independent in one seat, because, like, what are we doing here? And yeah, so again, I've talked to Allegra before on my podcast about the tax reform that she wants to implement. I will hopefully talk with her again, but I just think for my audience, I'll stick to my knitting. And I think anyone under 50 probably doesn't know what that means. I have to keep explaining myself that I'm just sticking to what I know. And I'll probably leave the politics until after the election, and then we can actually. So, for example, I had someone from the Labor Party email me Saturday afternoon with the release that you probably got under embargo about the changes. Hey, do you want to jump on the phone with Claire?
Claire who? Oh, Claire O'Neill, the housing minister?
Yeah, and I was like, oh, no, like, one, I didn't have the time, but two, I was like, oh, look, if Claire gets voted back in, absolutely, let's bring her in and let's chat of what her policies mean for my listeners. But I just don't want to pull that thread of the old slippery slope of having to cover every political party, because my listeners, I'm not a political podcast, they just want to hear about personal finance, retirement and all that stuff. Yeah,
it is a really fast-changing world. You've really framed it quite beautifully, actually, articulated these shifts that we're seeing. So as you watch this debate being played out both in the podcast world, and I kind of live there too, but in sort of an adjacent mainstream media / podcast positioning. How do you think we should approach it? Like, journalists like me, should we be defensive about our territory, or how do we manage this interaction?
You know, I had the same problem, and I guess my corner of the world has had the same problem. You know, traditional financial planning, you know, giving advice, structured framework. And now we've got all these people, and I'm now one of them, that are online talking about money. I mean, that's all well and good. I've got a general advice license. The world has changed. And I think that's the main thing that we need to know. The world has changed. And when it comes to, I guess, traditional media, you know, what they say, adapt or die. And we've seen that in various industries. And this is it, I don't know enough about journalistic integrity to have a view, but I think, you know, particularly if you want to talk to people, you've got to talk to them where they're at.
Absolutely. You've got to find them wherever they are. Just a quick one. Has the Liberal Party approached you?
No, which is interesting. I did reach out to them, I think, last election I was doing this. No one got back to me. I think I've reached out again. I'm sure I have, because I actually had Adam Bant on from the Greens before the election was called and before the budget was kind of underway. And yeah, they haven't. But to be honest, there's a new media, the Daily Oz. They've got the big Instagram and all that. And I think they put a story up where they wanted to get Dutton on. But it's almost like, well, why would a leader waste their time if they think that most of the listeners of that audience, they're rusted onto their, I think it is a judgment issue for the leader and their time, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Like, most of the people following the Daily Oz on Instagram, swing voters or undecided, I think we know the answer is probably no. Not sure.
It's such a fascinating shift. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks.
Both parties continued to campaign on their housing measures today with no new major announcements. They've settled into the middle week of the campaign just before the Easter break. Anthony Albanese was in Tasmania today visiting another urgent care clinic. He was quizzed on whether the government would release the modelling of the expanded 5% home deposit scheme.
In terms of the Treasury advice on your 5% deposit scheme, will you be releasing that advice? What is the definition in dollar figures of significant?
We don't release cabinet papers.
Prime Minister, but what's the definition of significant? I mean, for voters who want to know how much house prices could rise under that policy, what does significant mean?
Sorry, I'm not saying that house prices will rise.
But the Treasury advice says that price rise won't be significant.
No, well, we don't release Treasury documentation. You have the figure. The idea that they put a precise dollar on something is not right.
Meanwhile, Peter Dutton visited another building site in the seat of Hawke in Victoria, as well as his 10th petrol station of the campaign so far. The opposition leader brought out his son Harry for the second day in a row. He was peppered with questions as to whether he would help his children with a housing deposit after Harry spoke yesterday saying he was struggling to save up for a deposit. Now, Peter Dutton eventually relented to say yes.
I think, like every parent, I despair at the thought of our kids not being able to get into housing because they want their own place, and young families are putting off having kids. Older Australians, parents and grandparents, are staying in the workforce longer to try and provide their kids with some money. And I think our households are no different to many households where we want our kids to work hard, to save, and we'll help them with a deposit at some stage. But in many families, in a lot of families, most families across the country, they haven't got that luxury. And the Prime Minister and I might be able to help our kids, but it's not about us. It's about how we can help millions of Australians across generations realise the dream of home ownership.
Let's bring in our regular Tuesday panel. Sean Kelly is an author and columnist for the Nine papers and is a former advisor to two Labor Prime Ministers. Andrew Carswell is a former Prime Minister's Office advisor to Scott Morrison and now works as a consultant. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks, Patricia.
Great to be here.
Well, we had the dueling housing announcement. It's almost like they coordinated, guys, or maybe not so much. Andrew, what did you make of how late the big housing policies came and the spendathon attached?
Well, it's a bit of a tradition now to leave a housing policy late in the campaign, and it's proved to be effective before. You might remember Scott Morrison's deposit policy that he announced in 2019, a week before polling day, that had a dramatic effect on the result in that week. 7 days or 6 days out from the poll, and every day of that last week he was at a building site. Which is what Peter Dutton is mirroring this week. But every day of that last week of that campaign, his vote went up. So it can be quite effective because consistency is the key here, right? And we're seeing Peter Dutton arrive at building sites across the country. We're seeing him at petrol stations every day. It's that consistency of message. So while the government probably has a better housing policy to sell, an easier policy to sell, I trust Peter's ability to sell his policy better because he'll do it more consistently. We've seen a bit of a switch in the way that both leaders are approaching press conferences and their daily media habits every day. Whereas Peter Dutton is becoming more disciplined in the way that he talks. He's becoming very narrow in the way that he talks, whereas the Prime Minister is becoming a bit more verbose. He's returned to his old habits of just speaking off the cuff and just not being as disciplined as he was in the first week. So all the signs point to Peter Dutton being able to sell that policy, and that's the one that punters will remember.
Sean, how do you see it? Obviously, Claire O'Neill and the Prime Minister have been out selling the alternative housing policy. Obviously, Andrew's take is that the Prime Minister's not quite on message. What do you think?
Look, I think Andrew's probably being a bit optimistic for the coalition there. Not because what he says about Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese is wrong. I think Peter Dutton has been improving recently. I do think the last week of his campaign has been far stronger than the week before that. I think the great difficulty is I'm just not sure who wins a cost of living auction in the end. Everybody's talking about this as a cost of living election, and of course that means both sides need to talk about cost of living. They need to do that a lot. But I think once that general message is communicated to voters, that they're both talking about cost of living, that they both want to buy your vote, then I think it's very difficult for one or the other party to come out ahead unless there is a markedly better, more appealing policy on offer. And I don't think either side's done that particularly. I don't think any of the policies on offer are particularly good, by the way. So then does it come down to salesmanship? Well, if there was a massive difference between the two salesmen, yes. But while there might be a small advantage to Peter Dutton right now, I don't think it's massive. So I think we come to a bit of a draw here, and this reflects the muddy nature of the campaign. And in a way, it comes down to the question of who do you think is ahead? The polls affect the way we tell the stories of these campaigns, probably more than they should. The polls are clearly suggesting that Labor is in with a better chance at the moment. And that means I think we're probably looking at the coalition campaign slightly more damningly than we should. But it also, if those polls are to be believed, then Peter Dutton obviously has to make up more ground.
I want to talk about the insertion of Peter Dutton's son in the campaign. Andrew, yesterday we saw his son campaigning with him, talking about trying to save up and finding it hard to buy a house. Peter Dutton was asked the obvious question from journalists about whether he would help with that deposit. He only answered today that he would, and look, you'd expect most parents would want to, but given recently it was revealed that Peter Dutton's been pretty successful on the property market, is it a helpful moment, given these questions come up?
I don't think soft voters are fully aware of the Peter Dutton's wealth and, frankly, Anthony Albanese's wealth as well. So I don't think it cuts through. I'm sure it does in media land and those that are engaged in politics day to day. But soft voters wouldn't really naturally align Peter Dutton with someone that's significantly wealthy. Look, it's a fair question to be asked of Peter Dutton, and that's you open yourself up for those moments when you do invite your family on the campaign. I think Harry's injection in the campaign has been quite helpful. It's kind of softened Peter Dutton a little bit. You would have noticed in press conferences yesterday, he was a bit more smiley, he was a bit more jovial, he cracked a joke. I think it actually helps his tone. Because the last thing that Peter needs is to be in a slanging match with another guy, another older white bloke, and them arguing at each other across the barricades. Peter is at his best when his tone is right, when his tone is balanced. So I think Harry's injection in there is good. And look, the coalition is losing votes in the 18 to 35 category. Maybe Harry's injection will help that.
How interesting. That's a really interesting analysis. Sean, do you think it is about that 18 to 35 age group, trying to use Harry to cultivate that group?
I think 100% it is about that, and it is about softening Peter Dutton's image. And I think if you take a step back at a kind of more meta campaign level, I think you have to say, there's a bit of a warning to Labor here. I think the last few days have shown that Peter Dutton is recognising that he needs to take some risks and is willing to take risks, and that, if you are behind in a campaign, that's what you have to be willing to do, and that involves making yourself vulnerable. Now, the difficulty for Peter Dutton is that, as with so many bits of the campaign so far, there just wasn't a sense that had been prepared for particularly well. He didn't seem ready for the question about whether he'd help his son out, and then when he was pushed about it this morning, he said, well, this isn't about my family. And I just thought that was a bit odd, because he'd chosen, of course, to have his son stand by him and talk about this issue. So either it was about his family or it wasn't. Now, that's not a massive issue. It's just indicative, I think, of the kind of low-level problems that continue to dog the campaign. But overall, I would say, look, it does show he's trying here.
So it's a softening of his look. Do you think that people want a softer Peter Dutton, Andrew? Is that what you think the research is showing?
Well, I think traditionally you would segment that into different markets, but it's very hard to do that in a campaign. Everything is heightened, everything is made mainstream. Funnily enough, last year I was talking to someone in the coalition that knows a bit about this, and they said every time that we try and soften Peter's image, his numbers go down. So people naturally gravitate towards him, particularly men, because of his strength of leadership. So you're messing around with a few things when you do try and overdo it, and you've got to be real too. You've got to be presenting who you actually are, and Peter has this carefully crafted persona of who he is, and it's genuine. You've just got to be that person.
Yeah, you've always got to be yourself, because, every other role is taken, as the cliche goes, right? And I think that's right. But, Sean, I think that's an interesting insight. I don't know, Andrew, I don't think I've heard that before, or maybe I have, but the election campaign has made me tired. Sean, every time they've tried to soften his image, his numbers go down. So people want a sort of hard, strong figure in Peter Dutton. Do you think that's right?
Look, that doesn't surprise me at all. I think the great difficulty for Peter Dutton right now is that he is caught on the rocks between two images. This hard man of politics, which I think seemed to be working quite well for him in the early days of Donald Trump, and this stage of the campaign when the strong man is suddenly not in favour anymore. And I think it leaves Peter Dutton and the entire Liberal Party or the LNP in a little bit of a difficult spot, because I don't think they know where to lean to and what to lean away from. So you're kind of caught between this Trumpy rhetoric and attempts not to be Trumpy, attempts to be strong, attempts to be soft. And in a way, look, I think it could have been a piece of good advice to Peter Dutton to stay stronger, to kind of harden up that hard man image, but at the same time that was always going to cost him votes in other demographics. So I think if Peter Dutton loses this election, and we're a long way from the end of the election, and I don't think anybody should be counting their chickens yet, but if he does lose the election, I wonder if the conclusion will end up being that he just was always going to be a very difficult candidate to sell. Nobody's unelectable, of course, but I think this confused place that he's reached may have been inevitable.
Yeah. OK, so we've got the Easter break coming, and then we've got Anzac Day. I know we don't know how that exactly plays out because it has to happen first, but Andrew, I imagine it's a bit of a momentum killer. You're sort of gearing up and then you stop. Can it be helpful as well? How do you think that the parties will use that time?
Well, it's almost like half time, isn't it, at the footy? You put so much into the first half and then you have a breather and then we're away again. I think it's the way that things are looking now in the campaign, the last week in particular will be vital. There is such a solid amount of soft voters that are still there. It's in the order of 30 to 40%. It's massive. They will not be voting pre-poll. They'll be waiting until the last moment to make their decision, as has always been the case. It's the deciders that go out and vote early, and they'll vote in large numbers. So that week is critical. And selling that message, that economic message, throughout that week in the last days will be pivotal. And you've got to look at where the coalition's primary has come down to give you a picture of where things are at. It's come down from 40 to 35, according to Newspoll, in the space of 4.5 months. But it hasn't gone to Labor. It has sprayed to the left and it's gone to independents and Teals. It's sprayed to the right to One Nation and Clive Palmer. It's going everywhere except for Labor. Now, that gives the coalition some confidence that this fight is still there to be won, because that vote is parked. It's not solidified. It's not a decision. It's parked. So it's easy to pull back, and that last week of the campaign will be the time where they can do that.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. It is spraying. Sean, how does the spray work? Is it a good story for Labor, or is there a danger zone?
It's not a good story for Labor. It's a worse story for the coalition, obviously, at this point. I think it probably points to the story that I think is being underplayed in this campaign slightly, oddly, given all the talk of minority government, which is what ends up happening to the third party, minor parties, independents vote. The polling psephologist Kevin Bonham made a very good point today, which in most of the recent polls, for the first time, you have that category of others outpacing both of the major parties in their primaries, and that's the first time that's happened, he said, this term. So I think that's a really interesting statistic. And I would add, Patricia, there's all of this talk about the next couple of weeks being a write-off. I wonder if that is a bit of a throwback to the time when most people got their news from TV and then they switched off the TV when they went to the beach or you know, on holidays in whatever form. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure anyone really puts down their phone anymore. So I think the parties will have to be campaigning pretty strongly and actually have a pretty good chance of reaching people over the next couple of weeks.
Sean, that's why I invite you to. That's actually a really good point. I think that our digital addictions, talking for a friend, are definitely part of that story. Andrew, that's a good point, isn't it? It's not really just about the television pictures. It's about getting those messages out while people are scrolling at their, Sunday Easter lunch if they celebrate Easter.
Oh, absolutely. And you're seeing the way that parties partition this away now. And they use mainstream interviews, for instance, the Treasurer interview on the ABC in recent days. They use that opportunity to get their key messages out for social media and cut and dice and splice the messages and then straight onto social media and away you go. So it's a different way of thinking about it, but I think that's largely right. And
when you train your leader, you both work for leaders for these big events, and I have to promote our big event. Tomorrow we've got the big debate, free to air, 8 p.m. David Spears is the host, the moderator is really the word between the two leaders. Starting with you still, Andrew. What does that look like? What does prep look like? How different is tomorrow night's event to sort of more random voters that they faced last week?
Well, this one really focuses on nailing your lines and getting your policy settings right. So in a Sky debate, for instance, you're addressing an audience. So you're trying to engage with an audience member. With a head-to-head debate, you really are looking to sell your message effectively and as coherent as possible, and get a glove in on your opponent as well. So a lot of work goes into these debates, probably too much time. Scott used to carry a black book around that he would refer to when he had the time to do it. You'd go into a debate prep session the day before and the day of, just to ensure that those messages are being prepared for, and the attack points are also landing as well.
And who played Albanese?
Oh, to be honest, I can't remember. Someone asked me this the other day, but it's lost in the haze for me, Patricia.
OK. The haze is lost. Sean, I always find the people that are cast in the pretend role to be in the debate really interesting. Just talk to me about how you think Anthony Albanese might be approaching tomorrow night's debate on the ABC. I think I've got you there still, Sean, don't I?
Yep, you've got me.
Yeah, great. How do you think Anthony Albanese would be preparing for that debate?
I think the main thing he will be trying to do is not lose, is not make massive... So that's an obvious statement. What I meant to say is not make mistakes.
Yep.
Winning actually matters a lot less than it used to. That's a result of what I was talking about before, which is media fragmentation. I don't think these debates, sorry, Patricia, are quite the events that they used to be. But I do think making mistakes while the entire press gallery is watching on and ready to turn them into news stories is a huge potential problem. Now, that's a bigger problem for Anthony Albanese as the supposed front runner at this point. So that would be what he will be focusing on, not stuffing up.
Yeah, I mean, not making a mistake, not having a Joe Biden moment, which really killed his leadership, like that was obviously for lots of other reasons too, is a big one. I have to ask you as well, Sean, I have to be very balanced. You both, have worked in different parts of politics. Who played Tony Abbott back in the day? Do you remember?
Look, it may have been John Faulkner from vague memory, but I couldn't swear to it.
Right. There were a lot of people who impersonated Tony Abbott in the press gallery, I recall, because he has such a distinctive way of talking. But these things are kind of a big deal. After tomorrow is finished, and I just want to let our viewers know, actually, guys, you don't mind being part of this promo. Any moment now, the opposition leader, Peter Dutton's actually my guest, so I suppose I can ask him directly, although he may not want to share that with me at this stage. But any time one of these big events happens, after that event, I suppose, it's kind of the kind of end of a really big process. Do you expect the campaign to go to the bit of Friday, or do you think that they're going to sort of down tools after that, Andrew?
No, I think this plays out right to the end, and I would assume that Peter Dutton will be on a building site on Friday before the election. I assume he'll be at a petrol station on that Friday, just selling that message in. The beauty of being an underdog here is you can just charge home as hard as you possibly can. What we've seen from Anthony Albanese, he's almost put it in park. He's got the cruise control setting on. He thinks it's done. He thinks he's winning the next election after this. So the hubris is set in. That's an advantage for Peter Dutton to sell his message right up to that last day.
All right, we're out of time. Thank you to both of you.
Thanks, Patricia.
Returning to the reported request for a Russian airbase in Indonesia, the Prime Minister responded to questions this afternoon about when he knew about the reports. He says the government is seeking further information from the Indonesian government.
We are seeking further information. We obviously do not want to see Russian influence in our region, very clearly.
The opposition leader joins me now. Welcome to the program, Peter Dutton.
Patricia, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Peter Dutton, the Prime Minister, has voiced concern after reports Russia requested access to Indonesian Air Force Base. He has said that we obviously do not want to see Russian influence in our region very clearly. Do you agree with the Prime Minister?
Well, of course, Patricia, but I think the question here is whether or not the government had any forewarning. This would be a catastrophic error in the government systems if the DFAT under Penny Wong didn't know anything about it, if the Prime Minister hadn't spoken with the President. Obviously, the government was very critical of the former government in relation to engagement in Southeast Asia. So by the government's own test, by the government's own standard, if the government knew nothing about this, then I would be very surprised, and I presume the Prime Minister will answer those questions.
So just to be clear, what are you criticising? Because the Prime Minister is seeking information about what's going on. We still don't know the full details. Shouldn't we wait before we criticise?
Patricia, if there was a functioning relationship with Indonesia, as there must be, because Indonesia is an incredibly important ally and friend for us, then surely there would have been contact either at a departmental or at a ministerial level. Penny Wong has set the standard very high in terms of what the engagement needs to be, and the expectation that she's put upon others is that if there is a decision that's taken without engagement, without some foreshadowing with the Australian government, then that is a catastrophic failure. So I think by her own standards, Penny Wong has failed here. Of course, we don't want Russian planes or other military assets in our region based here. It's not in our country's best interest. It's not in the best interest of Southeast Asia. And Russia obviously has demonstrated its capacities, and President Putin, his own standards that he's set in relation to the conflict with Ukraine. So not somebody that we would welcome being permanently based here in our region.
You just said the Indonesian president announced this. When did he announce it?
Well, the Indonesian government, if there's detail that they need to provide to the Australian government, surely the relationship is so good under Penny Wong that the relationship would have demanded that we be given notice before this was made public. I just don't know what Penny Wong is doing.
She says been made public by the Indonesian government yet.
Well, let's hear from Penny Wong as to what she knew and when, because Penny Wong is somebody who has criticised others and her predecessors, and if the negotiations are taking place, then surely Australia would have been consulted. Now, if that's not the case, then that is a catastrophic failure according to Penny Wong's own standards, and I think she and the Prime Minister need to explain that.
But just to be clear, have I missed something? Has the Indonesian president announced this? That's not my understanding.
There's commentary that I've seen reported from the Indonesian spokesperson, and that's obviously come from the administration. There are reports of negotiations or discussions that have taken place between Russia and Indonesia. And if the government has the functioning relationship that they claim they have, then they should have engaged surely with Indonesia, or if Indonesia had that view, then they would have expressed some words of comfort to the Australian public or to the Australian minister. It just hasn't happened. So let's have a look at Penny Wong's track record.
The reason, I cannot wait to get her on the show and ask her, and you know I will. But my question is, where have you seen the Indonesian president confirm this? Aren't you verbaling the Indonesian president? Because I haven't seen him confirm this. He hasn't talked publicly about it.
There's comment that's come out of the administration, out of the Prabowo administration. So there's conversations that are reported to have taken place between Russia and Indonesia. The Prime Minister has spoken about it. He obviously knew nothing about it. That's the reality. Okay. And neither did Penny Wong. But Penny Wong has set a standard here which she hasn't met herself. And I just hope that she's able to explain exactly what's taken place.
So if it is confirmed, and we are in the infancy of what this might be, as I want to be very clear to our viewers, but if it is, what do you expect the Australian government to do in return? How should we respond?
Well, we should make it very clear that we don't think it's in our security interest to have Russian assets based not too far from our border. We don't believe that it is in the interest of stability within the region to have those assets based in Indonesia. Now, Indonesia is a sovereign nation. They make decisions for themselves, but we have put a lot of work into the relationship.
Should they really be giving us a heads up? If you say they're a sovereign nation, what is their responsibility to us?
Well, there would be engagement if that was the case, if it was being considered, and if they had a relationship with the Albanese government. Again, Penny Wong's made great claims about how well connected she is through Southeast Asia, and she's finding out about it on ABC 24.
Well, look, we still, again, haven't confirmed a lot of these details. Don't we have to be really, really cautious when we're dealing with, a big neighbour like this, about not verballing or going too far before we can ascertain the details?
Patricia, there are public reports in relation to the claim that's been made. There's obviously been a lot of activity between Russia and China and Indonesia, etc. That's a matter of public record. So I think the government, if they claim that they've got a good relationship with Indonesia and countries in the region, that should be two-way, and there should be an engagement. And the Prime Minister should be standing up to say, look, this issue's been raised with us. We appreciate the Indonesians raising with it. We've expressed our concerns. But of course that hasn't happened. And I think the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, if they're being honest, would say that this came as a surprise to them, which by their own standard would be a catastrophic failure, similar to what they accused the previous Foreign Minister of. And the double standard that operates here is, I think, on display for all to see.
So, obviously, we are sovereign nations and we have a relationship. Your government negotiated AUKUS. Did you give Indonesia the heads up that we were entering AUKUS?
I met with Prabowo as the Defence Minister when I was Defence Minister. We spoke to our counterparts in relation to the AUKUS deal before arrangements were made. There were details that we were able to provide, some that we weren't. But
so they knew before the Australian public?
Well, we had a conversation with them, which I'm not going into, obviously, but we respected the relationship and we sat down with them and spoke about the security concerns that we had, particularly and specifically in relation to, I mean, the Prime Minister's spoken publicly about this, the deteriorating situation in the Indo-Pacific, and we spoke about our needs to make sure that we had proper defences in place, and we had that conversation with Indonesia and with other countries as part of the engagement out of respect for the relationship, and there were some details that we weren't able to provide, but many that we were.
You used the word catastrophe. Isn't that word a bit extreme for what we're potentially dealing with here?
Patricia, I think go back and have a look at Penny Wong's own words in relation to how she described Maurice Payne and her engagement in the region, which was completely unfounded, but that was the standard that Penny Wong set, and she's either prepared to live by her own standard or be accused of hypocrisy. You can take your choice, and I think ultimately what's important here is our sovereignty, our nation's interests. We're a good, trusted, reliable partner in the region. We have a long-standing and important relationship with Indonesia, and Penny Wong has claimed to have a superior relationship with all countries compared to any of her predecessors, and it just seems that she hasn't lived up to that, and I think that's the standard that she should be held to.
Just one more question on this. I'm desperate to talk about housing. It is actually my favourite topic, Peter Dutton, but just one more on this.
Oh, that's good.
It is. How can it not be? It's the biggest issue in our country for sure. Have the spy agencies failed?
Well, again, I haven't got the briefing from any of the agencies. We've requested that today. Well, I've requested that briefing today, so let's wait and see what they have to say. All
right, let's talk housing. It's pretty important that we do talk housing. It's clear that Australia's housing crisis is a problem with supply. We don't have enough houses. To all the young Australians that are pretty worried about finding a home, how do you explain the fact that you're quite prepared to spend billions of dollars on building nuclear power stations, but not actual houses for them?
Well, firstly, I want the lights to stay on in their house. We live in a country where it's good if the power is reliable and it's affordable, and our energy policy is 44% cheaper than Labor's policy. It'll mean the lights can stay on, which is really important if you want to, have a fridge and run your household and raise kids, etc. Energy, electricity, gas is really important, and under Labor, that's not guaranteed. So we've said that we want a $5 billion plan to build new houses, and that brings about 500,000 new home lots onto the market. We'll work with councils, and what we can do is have a look at the blockages in their system. So they might not be able to afford the sewerage or the water or the road upgrades, and we can provide them with some funding to complete that so that we can get the next stage of land to the market. And that releases, as I say, 500,000 additional lots on the supply side, which is really important. So you raise a really important point. The other thing we've done in that regard is that we've put a 2-year ban in place for foreign buyers so that they can't be competing against young Australians trying to buy homes and units here in Australia. We've also said that we're going to cut migration because a big part of the demand problem is that Labor has increased immigration over the course of the last 2 years by more than 70% in any 2-year period in our country's history. So when you bring 1 million people in, and they all want a house as well, and you stop the supply side, which is exactly what the CFMEU has done, then you create this housing crisis, which is exactly where Labor's got us at the moment.
But to the philosophy, right? Obviously, I'm not asking you to, do the same thing as Labor. You have your own policies. But to the philosophy of the government building homes, just like you think it's okay to do with nuclear, do you think philosophically it's worthy to actually increase supply?
If you're asking me to comment in relation to the government's policy...
Well, no, I do. I think the concept of the government building homes so we can have more houses.
Well, I think the private market has demonstrated that they're much more efficient at building homes. That's why we've got Metricon and Simmons Homes and AV Jennings and all of these companies who are building homes. It's not, the Albanese government home building company. It doesn't work. and it hasn't worked for this government because their signature home building program hasn't built one house, and that's the problem. The Prime Minister's out there saying that he'll build 100,000 homes at $100,000 each. I mean, you can't get much. I mean, you can't get a frame stood for that. You might be able to get a slab poured and the block cut, and but I mean, the Prime Minister's, the wheels are falling off that policy already within 48 hours. So I don't think there's much hope being held out in that regard. What we've said is that we've listened to young Australians, young professional couples, singles who are working hard, might be living in the city or in the outer metro areas, in regional areas, and they just can't. They can't buy a house. They can't afford, when they go to the bank, they can't get the loan. So what we've said is that for the first $650,000 of the mortgage, will allow you to claim a tax deduction for the interest component for the first 5 years. For the average taxpayer, that will mean about $11,000 or $12,000 a year.
Okay,
so that helps them get the loan, and it helps them pay it off.
Claire O'Neill says that means then renters, through the tax system, subsidise the people that have gotten in. That's right, isn't it? That's what happens when you give this tax perk to some, and others who are stuck in the rental market are subsidising these people to pay off their homes.
So just in terms of the government's record and their credibility here, rents under this government have risen by 18%. For every 42 international students that they've brought in, there's one rental accommodation place that's been approved but not yet built, and that's why they've driven up the cost of rent. So it's hard to take somebody like Claire O'Neill seriously when under the signature program they've not built one single house, and that's why Australians have suffered, because we haven't had the supply side measures to bring on more housing, and we have had demand increase dramatically, and the government's building program is a disaster. So we want to clean that up, and we want to just accept, Patricia, that the pressures now for this generation of Australians trying to buy a home are much different than they were for my generation or for my parents or grandparents, and it takes a lot more of disposable income to pay or service the loan.
So
it's
let me
huge,
ask
and
this then.
that's exactly what we're doing.
So after 5 years, I know that's a while away, but after 5 years, if you're elected, are you really going to have people's, they're going to be paying so much more for their mortgages? That's going to be a rude shock, isn't it? Are you prepared to deliver that news to those people?
No, we're up front. I mean, that's the arrangement that we've put in place. And the reason for that is that people have got stamp duties, they've got legals, they've got obviously construction costs if they're building a new house. If they're moving into a unit, there are all sorts of costs. All of those front-end costs are very significant, and they're part of a reason that young Australians just feel locked out of the housing market at the moment. So the first 5 years, where you can have your mortgage under control, you can start to pay down some of the capital, the principal amount or the purchase price that you paid, and you can see an increase in value in the unit or house that you buy as well. That gets you over the most difficult period in that first 5 years. And then people can sell the unit or house, they can stay in it forever. That's their choice, whatever they want to do. But the government assistance package that we've provided for mortgage deductibility, I think is a game changer for a lot of young Australians, and I think it will see people get into housing who, under this government, have lost that hope.
One of the National Party's top hopes for an election pickup in Western Australia is Mia Davies, as you know. She's actually blasted the Coalition's opposition to Labor's resources production tax credits, saying good policy deserves support. Doesn't that mean you might actually have someone in your party room who thinks it's a good policy? Is it worth revisiting then?
Well, we've had a look at the policy, and we've spoken to many in the industry in WA as well. We've found other ways to provide support. The government stopped the funding for the junior miners policy. We've reinstated that. We have said that we would quickly approve the North West Shelf extension, which is 3,000 jobs. But
what's your message then to Mia Davies, who doesn't agree with you?
Well, we've been very clear from the moment that was announced in the budget before last that we don't support the measure, but we do want to see more mining in WA because, as the Cook Labor government points out, that's great for the state economy, but it's also good for the national economy. We're not building roads and paying for teachers and nurses, etc., on the East Coast without the revenue coming from WA. So I want to make sure that we can see WA boom and we can see the jobs created, the taxes and royalties paid, and that's how we can afford to to run our country.
You know I don't mind taking up a lot of time. I'm sorry. You always tell me I take too much time, but I've got another question. Let me ask. It's
Sure.
only
Fire
fair.
away.
I've been waiting for you, Peter Dutton, the whole campaign, so give me just this. I'm really interested to get your thoughts on this polling. It was released today by Resolve. It found that 68% of voters believe that Trump's victory in the US election has been a bad outcome for Australia. That doesn't work very well for you either, according to their polling. So I want to ask you this. Wait, there's a question coming. You described Mr. Trump in February as a big thinker and a deal maker, and that he's not become the president of the US for the second time by being anything other than shrewd. Do you stand by these comments that he's a big thinker?
Well, Patricia, at this election, what people see on their ballot paper is the Liberal Party or the Labor Party to form government. My argument is that the Prime Minister's wanting to talk about all of these issues, everything but the last 3 years in his track record. The negative campaigns, the slurs against me, all of that is designed to take your attention away from the government's failure of the last 3 years. So this election is not about anybody else, but Anthony Albanese being elected as Prime Minister or me being elected as Prime Minister. We can get our country back on track. We can reduce petrol prices by 25 cents a litre. We can give $1,200 back to people. This is what the election is about, and it's about. No, but this is it. I mean, we can all of these international factors, including Indonesia, etc., that we spoke about earlier. All of those will be challenges for the Prime Minister of the day.
Well, they'll be for
my
any
job
Prime
is to
Minister,
stand
right?
up for our country.
So, what do you say to people who say that you're just like Donald Trump?
Well, I just think it's a campaigning slogan from a desperate government who wants to talk about anything but what they've done over the last 3 years. We've had 2 years of household recession in this country. People are struggling to pay their bills. People aren't insuring their cars or their houses. They're making a decision not to insure it because they haven't got enough money in their budget to pay for food. These are the issues which I think are important to Australians. The distractions and, you know, the sort of shiny objects that...
I'm like, just to take you to the essence of what I'm asking, is your message to Australian voters, they do watch this show, and we will share this on the internet too, is your message...
I'm sure.
They do, I can assure you, Peter Dutton. Is your message that you're not going to be like Donald Trump? Because they're looking over there, Australians, and they are disturbed.
If you have a look at my track record over the last 20-odd years, the biggest influence in my political life has been John Howard. He ran a stable government. He cleaned up a Labor mess when he came into power. He implemented the gun law reforms in our country. I want to keep our country safe as well. I want to make sure that the economy can be well managed. That's my political influence, and I think if you have a look at my record, I have served our country, I think, with distinction in the portfolios that I've served in. I was a police officer for 10 years. I come from a pretty humble background, and I've worked hard every day in this job, and I want to be a Prime Minister to restore the dream of home ownership. I want to make sure that we can be a safe country in a very uncertain period in the world's history, and I think people can make their own judgments from that. What I don't want is our country to suffer for another 3 years, because at this election Mr Albanese is promising just more of the same cost increases which families and small businesses just can't afford. Two
quick ones before your staff kill me, and this one's an important one. Quick answer. Honestly, will you cut free TAFE?
We've said that we're not supportive of the government's policy in relation to TAFE, and other taxpayers, to your earlier point, are paying for that. We want to put $12,000 as a wage subsidy into particularly the construction sector to try and get those young tradies skilled up as quickly as possible. The completion rates in TAFE are at 13%, which is not a good spend of taxpayers' money, and I want to make sure that we have the best system possible so that we've got trainees coming through and apprentices coming through. We want to lift that number up to 400,000. Under this government, they've dropped by tens of thousands. So if you have a look at the track record of the previous coalition government and this government, we actually did much better under the old system in relation to apprentices and trainees. So you will get rid of
free TAFE. Just final question. I'm so sneaky. Who's playing Anthony Albanese in your debate preparation?
No one, to be honest. We're not running it like that. We have an honest discussion about the debate issues and topics, and bits and pieces. But I know he's got Daniel Andrews. We haven't seen Daniel Andrews enough in this campaign. I think he should be out and proud if he's in there, locked at the hip with Jacinda Ardern and Anthony Albanese. I think Victorians would want to see more of that, and it'd be fantastic if you could invite the three of them onto your program to talk through what it is they think they can offer the Australian people.
You know, I excessively invite people onto my program, sometimes in full caps.
Indeed,
yes.
you do. You type in full caps.
I do. I type in full caps. Someone else does that, don't they? Thank you so much, Peter Dutton. I appreciate your time.
Take care. Thank you.
Let's bring in my political panel for today. Josh Burns, Labor MP for Macnamara, and James Stephens, Liberal MP for Sturt, who is the Assistant Shadow Minister for Government Waste. Welcome to both of you.
Afternoon, PK.
I've delayed you both, sorry. I have been pursuing the opposition leader to come onto the program for some time, which is why I've actively harassed him, I think. But I got him on the program. We had a very interesting conversation, I think, about a couple of issues. I want to start with this Indonesia story, and I'm going to start with you, if I can, Josh, because a lot of comments made there by the opposition leader about, it being a catastrophe if Labor wasn't warned. What's your response? Because he suggests that the government has dropped the ball here.
Well, I would say let's act calmly and rationally here, and let's not overinflate the situation, as is often Peter Dutton's instinct, is to sort of throw the spears first and then ask questions later. The government has sought advice from Indonesia, and obviously there are media reports around here, but let's get to the bottom of this, find out what the situation is, and then we can respond accordingly and make sure that we're constantly acting in our national interest. I mean, one of the things that we did in coming into government was to ensure that we're stabilising relationships in our region, to ensure that the countries that the previous coalition government decided to scream and shout at were actually treated like adults, and that's something that is very important when guiding our foreign policy, is that we act calmly, assertively, and in Australia's national interest, and I'm sure that we're going through those processes through the appropriate channels right now.
James, is this a version of the coalition not being calm when we need to be calm as a country at times like these?
Well, I'm not worried about being calm. I'm worried about knowing what's going on, Patricia. It's very concerning and startling that the Russians might be considering some kind of armed forces deployment into our near neighbour. Given what the Russians are getting up to in other parts of the world, it's very significant and serious. I think suggesting we should all just calm down and not ask some pretty pertinent questions is not taking our national security seriously at all.
Well, OK, Josh, I have to put that back to you. You're not taking our national security situation seriously at all, because we've seen international affairs disrupt this campaign a couple of times. Obviously, this is worrying. Russia that close, Indonesia's not far. Is this an example of the government taking its eye off this?
The relationship with Indonesia is one where we treat it with absolute respect, where we engage constructively with Indonesia. And the first trip that the Prime Minister made when he became the Prime Minister was to Jakarta. And so I think that this relationship is one that we Australians can feel assured that we take it extremely seriously, and while James, might want to rant and rave, that's not how diplomacy happens, and I think it's really important that we find out exactly what the situation is, and then Australia can make its position very clear at that point. So that's what my understanding is. What's going on is that we've already made very high-level brief contact with the Indonesian counterparts, and we'll continue to do so in the sort of appropriate channels.
So both parties are now campaigning on housing, which the timing is everything, isn't it? At both of your launches, housing becomes a priority. Obviously, it's all pitched for the millennial and Gen Z voters. James, I'll start with you. Have you both basically accepted that house prices should be inflated with these policies?
Not with what we've announced, no. I mean, we've announced an incentive to bring more properties into the market because, of course, we've said we want to provide tax deductibility for mortgages where first home buyers are buying a newly built home. So that, of course, will create a dramatic market incentive for more supply to come into the system. Obviously, first home buyers will vote with their wallets, in our view, and the sort of savings they can achieve, up to about $12,000 potentially of deductible interest in a year, is going to mean they're going to seek out new properties, and that incentive, we believe, will drive supply into the market, which is desperately what we need. We've got a supply challenge, and we've got young people losing the dream of home ownership, and we've announced a policy that addresses both of those very comprehensively.
I'll give you a right of reply, Josh, on your policy, because it's also by some economists, actually even by the government's own accounting. You've said that it will have some impact on house prices, although the government says not much. Why not release your modelling?
Oh, look, I'll leave that to Claire O'Neill to release all of the data. But what I would say, a couple of things, is that how can you take the Liberal Party seriously when for the last 3 years every single measure that we have introduced into the Parliament to increase housing supply has been opposed by the Liberal Party? I mean, there has literally not been one single housing measure, whether it's be the Housing Australia Future Fund, or incentives for build to rent, or incentives for the state governments to build more housing across our country. Every single measure the Liberal Party's opposed. And right now, if you're a young person or you're trying to get into the housing market, what we know is that the deposit can be the biggest barrier to get into the housing market. So instead of the coalition not assisting anyone into getting into being able to afford that deposit, what we want to do is support any young person or anyone seeking to get into the housing market and buying their first home is to be able to purchase it with a 5% deposit, guaranteeing the purchase of that home, and meaning that you won't have to pay lender's mortgage insurance, which will save people around $23,000. That's the big barrier that people are facing, and we want every single young person and every single person who wants to buy their first home to know that it's possible under Labor, and that's what we'll deliver if you vote Labor at the election.
God, we're so in an election campaign. There's always the good last line from both of you. James, why not build houses? Why not get in the business of building houses? I put this to the opposition leader for anyone who was watching a little earlier. You're prepared to build nuclear, but why not houses for Australians that are desperate for them?
Well, we've got a private sector that builds houses just fine.
Is it doing a very good job? We don't have enough.
Well, that's not the fault of the builders, though, of course, Patricia. I mean, there's huge issues around planning laws and land release. We've announced a policy to spend $5 billion on helping to unlock new developments into the system, which should free up to around 500,000 new housing lots coming online. There's been a failure of government policy, not a failure of the home builders, and frankly, I wouldn't trust the Albanese government to build a home for me. They can't get anything else right in our lives right now. I think we stick with the people that know what they're doing when it comes to building homes, but we make the policy adjustments that are going to address the challenges that people are facing, like what we've announced with a variety of our policy positions, particularly the deductibility of interest for new home buyers.
So you don't think you should get in that business? Well, it's a reasonable question about the public sector and the private sector and how that will interact, Josh. Given we do have many developers, in fact, they do, complain that it's really hard to even get through all of the regulations and trying to get through the permit systems and the layers. Why should the government compete in that process when it's been hard to even build the backlog that exists?
There's a complicated picture in the housing sector that I think it's important to unpack it a little bit. First of all, a lot of the levers that control the time in which a home can be built are controlled by the state governments and the local councils. We're trying to incentivise the speedier passage of those processes so that the costs don't grow for the construction of homes. But this is really important, and let's focus on what the role of the federal government is, and that is to support and incentivise and invest in the construction of new homes. And the Liberal Party have opposed every single home that we've tried to build, including 20,000 social housing homes, which include 4,000 homes for women and children who are seeking to flee domestic violence. The Liberal Party couldn't even support the construction of those 4,000 homes across the country. There is literally not one single housing policy that they were willing to compromise enacting the Australian national interest. Instead, the Liberal Party has opposed everything. And I think that our record of actually getting projects started, to invest in a whole range of different incentives to make sure that the cost of construction comes down, that housing becomes more affordable, that we start building and addressing supply, as well as helping people who want to buy their first home, is something that, frankly, the Liberal Party's track record on is appalling. And we're focused on the job we need to do, and we've set out a really ambitious policy to try and keep building on it.
So the housing policies are the last policies you're trying to really sell. I am confused, though, and I'm going to ask both of you why, when young people have been screaming for so long saying we feel like the system is cooked, why it seemed like the sort of a last-minute promise at the election launches? Like, I know it seems like a process question, but James, it does go to, and it's to both of you actually, why it does come so late when you know, young people are hard to reach. Why have you waited this long to even raise this?
Well, we made it the centrepiece of our campaign launch. That demonstrates how significant it is for us. Of course, we're in opposition seeking to come into government. It is surprising that the 3 years Labor have had to address housing have resulted in abject failure, and they need new measures after 3 years of being in government to try and get things on track. But it was a centrepiece of our campaign launch. It's something that we'll be talking about in the most important, final 3 weeks of the campaign. I think people will understand and digest very quickly what we've announced on the weekend, and I think it'll be a big factor in young people deciding to support the coalition come election day. For Labor, it's a different matter. They've had 3 years, they've got an atrocious record of failure, and I don't think people will be buying any new snake oil from them when the stuff they'd already bought has been so manifestly inadequate.
Josh, snake oil, is that what you're selling? And addressing the same question, because I think it's important for consistency. Why do we only hear, yes, they're the launch, but they're launches late into the campaign?
I mean, the premise that we haven't been doing things in housing is completely absurd from James. And I'll give you one example. So there was a Help to Buy scheme, which is a shared equity scheme, which happens, you know, there's a number of state governments that have shared equity schemes where governments essentially purchase a portion of the home, and it means that people on lower and middle incomes can get into the housing market with a much lower deposit, and therefore specific, you know, people like teachers and nurses and others. Now, it's a pretty restricted program that isn't like the one we announced on the weekend, which is for anyone, but it's an example of how we are there to support people getting into the housing market. And the Liberal Party voted against it with the Greens, with their numbers in the Senate, and held it up for months and months and months. So the delays in the housing sector and the housing policy over the last 3 years can only be attributed to the Liberal Party, who have opposed absolutely every measure that we've introduced in the Parliament. And thankfully, we've been able to get the majority of the ones we want to do in the first term through. And now we've outlined the next stages of how can we expand it, how can we rise to the moment of helping young people buy their first home. It's so important, and the policy that we've announced is something that's going to hopefully make a big difference to the lives of the people that we're privileged to represent.
Final question to both of you, and this came up on Q&A last night. That episode is on iView. I can't help but spruik it. It was such an incredible episode in the seat of Bruce. In the Melbourne outer suburbs, my heartland, such a beautiful part of Australia, where, of course, you're both competing to win some seats. But the big question is, right, James, do you think Australia needs to be made great again?
Look, we are a fantastic country that is let down by a bad government. We need a new government. Doesn't mean that we don't have a fantastic country as it is, but our government is letting us down, and we need a new government to get Australia back on track.
Back on track, OK. I've heard that slogan before. Josh, well, it's a bit of a free kick question to you about the sort of MAGA slogan, but you can still answer.
Well, the Liberal Party absolutely adores the MAGA movement here in Australia. It's why we've got Liberal Party senior members chanting MAGA slogans and wearing MAGA hats and trying to emulate the policies of the MAGA movement. I mean, Peter Dutton has outlined policies like the Doge policy of Elon Musk, and he's got Jacinta Price, standing in front of him chanting MAGA slogans. That is not what Australians want. And when you look at the tariffs that have been put on Australia that have, had a huge impact on the stock market, Australians are literally holding their phones, looking at their superannuation, being affected by tariffs of the MAGA movement, and thinking, what on earth is this about? And yet you've got the Liberal Party standing in front of cameras chanting MAGA slogans. It's completely mad and not in Australia's interest. We're going to do things the Australian way, and we're going to look after the Australian people and hopefully protect them from the tariffs that apparently the Liberal Party is cheerleading from the sidelines on.
Thank you to both of you, and I'm sorry for delaying you, but I always want to talk to people running for Prime Minister, so you've stuck around. Really appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, PK. Thanks, James.
Thanks, PK.
Here are some of the top stories this hour. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has called on the federal government to explain what it knew and when in relation to reports Russia wants to base aircraft at a military airport in the Indonesian province of Papua. A US military website has reported Moscow lodged an official request with Indonesia to base Russian long-range aircraft at the Air Force base. The Defence Minister, Richard Marles, says Australia's been engaged on the issue with Indonesia at a high level. The West Australian Greens have cancelled a dance party scheduled for Anzac Day after condemnation by the Prime Minister and the opposition leader. And Labor frontbencher Claire O'Neill has slammed the Nationals leader over comments he made about a federal Labor MP. On Monday, Nationals boss David Littleproud said Victorian MP Lisa Chesters had about as much pull as a chihuahua. Mr Littleproud has since said he's willing to apologise and that he meant no malice. Ms O'Neill says the comments were unacceptable. Now, I want to bring in a moment my next guest, who's the Greens Senator Sarah Hanson-Young. But just to recap on this afternoon's stories before we get her, there was a big announcement, of course, over the weekend in relation to housing. Both the opposition leader, Peter Dutton, who joined us earlier, and the Prime Minister have been out campaigning on housing. But there's been a bit of a disruption with reports, just reports. The government is seeking clarity on the idea that Russia wants to access a military base in Indonesia, which, of course, would be disturbing for our region. To get the Greens' point of view on lots of things, I'm going to welcome now Sarah Hanson-Young. Welcome.
Good afternoon, PK. Thanks for having me.
This issue has kind of blown up this afternoon, so I want to start there if we can. Peter Dutton was on a little earlier. He was heaping pressure on the Prime Minister about why Indonesia hadn't given our nation the heads up. Now, we don't know all of the details. We're seeking clarity. But does he have a point? Should they have given us the heads up here?
Well, I think firstly, of course, it's concerning. I think the last thing most Australians would want to see is Russia coming into this region and putting any type of military base nearby, escalating tensions throughout the region. But yes, we do need to know what's going on. I have some sympathy with the idea of, let's not react without all the facts, but I think it's right to be asking questions, absolutely. And it does really put into perspective, though, just how sensitive and how volatile things are right now, right across the globe. And the person who's supercharged that like nobody else, of course, is Donald Trump. And whether it's Australia hooking our wagon to the Americans with AUKUS and the tensions that has created in our region, and now this, and Australia's got to be really careful. And it is why we need our own independent foreign policy, because just following along as Donald Trump's, little cousin, isn't going to cut it for being stable here in our region, for being friendly with our neighbours, and for being taken seriously by the rest of the world.
I want to move to a couple of other issues if we can. Obviously, we'll keep a watching eye on how the other one develops. It is an important story for our region. But just to housing policy, everyone's focusing on housing. Who would have thought it? Focusing on the biggest crisis that young people tell us they're facing. I know you have different ideas, but do you acknowledge that, at least at the core, these ideas by the opposition and Labor may assist some young people at least getting into housing?
Well, I think what is good is that we are now having a debate about the policy settings and reforms needed to deal with this housing crisis. Because you're right, this has been bubbling along, and frankly, it really has been the Greens we've been putting this front and centre for a number of years now, saying there is a problem here. Young people are being priced out of the market. We're about to lose an entire generation of Australians who just will never be able to afford their own home. They can hardly afford the rent right now, let alone a deposit and monthly repayments. And then you've got families who are in the housing market and they're struggling to pay the rent because the mortgages have gone up, and we still have an RBA board who's refusing to meet and cut interest rates this month because they've set down their meeting for next month. I mean, I think they should just get on and do it this week. Australians would pat them all on the back if they did that. So, look, yes, the ideas are different, but it is good to be seeing the debate front and centre in this election campaign. I'm disappointed, though, that what Labor has put forward is kind of more tinkering around the edges, while they do acknowledge there is a problem. But we are worried about what Peter Dutton's policy will do. I've been listening to what the experts have said. I listened to a number of the experts who you had on Q&A last night, PK, really pointing out that if you wanted to solve this problem for the long term, the policy that Peter Dutton has put forward just isn't it. In fact, it might make the situation even worse by pushing house prices higher and pushing young people into much higher debt. That's if they're lucky to even get their foot in the market, and then saddled with huge amounts of debt is not actually the Australian dream. The Australian dream is being able to get a good education, get a job, buy a house, have a family, have a life filled with all of the things that make a life worth living, and being saddled with debt while the big banks keep getting richer. I can tell you what, that's not the Australian dream.
You've announced, or the Greens have announced, this free lunch policy, which I think is worth a free school lunch, I think it's called, misspoken. I just want to know, right, why do all kids get a free lunch? Like, given some parents, they can afford to feed their own kids, can't they? Like, just explain to me the merits of this.
Well, this is a policy that we've launched today that would put free lunches in every public school for every kid, because all of the evidence shows that when kids are well fed, they learn better and they're better behaved and they're happier. And we know that at a time of cost of living crisis, lots of families are really struggling right now. And kids, sadly, kids are going to school hungry, or they're going to school without much in their lunchbox, if anything at all. And we're a wealthy country by international standards, and we should be able to make sure kids have food in their belly so that they can study well and enjoy being at school and love learning. If you're not happy because you're hungry, it's going to be very hard to learn. The other thing, though, I think about this policy, Patricia, is, as a parent, as somebody, my daughter just graduated from Year 12, at the end of last year, but I tell you what, 12 years worth of doing school lunches, or at least the first 6, the primary school, lots of parents around the country would be going, oh my gosh, yes, could we have that off our plate? So in the mornings, it'd make life a whole lot easier. It's cheaper, and knowing that your kids are going to go to school and get a good, nutritious meal and be able to learn, that's an investment in the future of this country. It's an investment in educational outcomes, in health outcomes, in good outcomes for the community.
OK, but it is expensive to roll that out at all state schools. So, and lots of parents who send their kids to state schools, they can afford to pay for lunch for their kids. I mean, there are all sorts of parents who are on higher incomes.
We have a public education system.
Yeah, but we don't pay for everything. We do raise our own kids. You paid for your own kids' stuff, I'm sure. I pay for their lunches. Isn't that like our job as parents?
This is about trying to think about how to make our schools better places for learning and better places for our kids to be on those 6 hours a day or more that they are there. And our public education system is based on being free and universal. Of course, there's been creeping in of school fees that parents have to pay, those kind of ancillary costs that have crept in. I mean, it is becoming a bigger and bigger problem that beyond just sending your kid to the local school, you now have to keep forking out a whole lot of extra money. And the Greens have concerns about that as well. We don't think parents should be slapped with huge hundreds of dollars worth of school fees to send their kid to the local public school. But this is about a choice. And at the moment, we're spending billions of dollars, $12.5 billion subsidising with taxpayers' money the big fossil fuel corporations. Now, some people might argue that's well spent. I would say I'd prefer to see that money spent on our kids in our schools so that they're happy, healthy and learning. So it's about a choice. And it's the same with the housing policy. We have choices to make here. And the Greens are saying on housing, it's time to wind back those overly generous tax handouts to wealthy property developers in those capital gains and negative gearing settings, so that actually young people in this country can have a good shot at owning their own home, whether they're buying it at auction or buying it at a set price. They actually have an opportunity, and they're not battling against big property developers who are getting a tax handout. It's about choice. And that's what this election is all about. There's the Labor Party, there's the Liberal Party. Increasingly, voters are saying, oh, well, Peter Dutton's campaign looks like it's been, really tanked by Donald Trump. They're looking at the Labor Party, but they're still not happy. They want an alternative to hold Labor to account and push them on the things that really matter and make them act. And that's why they're looking at policies that the Greens are putting forward and asking us to be there at the table, to negotiate and to push hard.
Just final question. On Anzac Day, the Greens in WA would be holding there was an idea for a dance party fundraiser at a venue in Perth. My understanding is it has been cancelled, has it?
My understanding is it's been cancelled or rescheduled. Yes, that's right. I mean, I think that speaks for itself, Patricia. I was surprised when I heard that it had been scheduled for that day. I think the organisers have seen better for it, and it'll be on a different day, which I think is appropriate. I'm, for one, beautiful Adelaide, my home state. I'll be heading down to the dawn service here on that Friday, and looking forward to, thinking and remembering and really understanding what those sacrifices of our men and women who take these brave positions really means for the rest of the country and our communities. So that's what I'll be looking forward to on April 25.
OK, and some breaking news, and I'd love to get your reaction to it, given you did say you were concerned when I first asked. We understand that the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, has spoken to his Indonesian counterpart and had it confirmed to him that there will be no Russian planes based in Indonesia. Does that satisfy you?
I think it's good news to hear that Russia won't be on our doorstep. We shouldn't have Donald Trump and his increased military presence, and we certainly shouldn't have the Russians.
Always great to speak to you, Senator. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Patricia.
Well, an extended afternoon briefing this afternoon. It's been quite a wild afternoon of news. Reporter Tom Crowley has been on the road with the opposition leader Peter Dutton this week and has been following the Liberal leader's housing policy tour quite closely. He knows a lot about these areas. I've often picked his brain, and now he's in the studio with me. Tom, hello.
Hi, PK. How are you?
Good. I spoke to the opposition leader about lots of things a little earlier, including, of course, the housing policy. There is not a safe estate at the moment, is there? On the outskirts of Melbourne particularly, the opposition leader has been travelling around. Just give me a sense of what his pitch has been.
It's a dangerous place to be if you don't want to be in a political photo opportunity. It's really this pitch that's been building for a little while now, with the coalition talking about the outer suburbs building out rather than building up. It's something that I think helps them to talk to two constituencies. Interested to hear your view on this, because they can talk to first home buyers who might be interested in buying in these suburbs, but at the same time keep one eye, I think, on people in the sort of middle suburbs who are worried about densification, shall we say. I won't use the N for NIMBY word.
NIMBY, not in my backyard.
That's right. And so, Peter Dutton wasn't in Chisholm today. He wasn't in Kooyong. But I think the voters in those seats, there was one eye on them as well. And that's the discussion we've been having on both sides over the last couple of days about exactly what should happen to house prices. I think there's a little bit of coded language going on here, because from the perspective of a young person who, for example, might be used to hearing the Greens talk, when you hear Peter Dutton say, I want house prices not to fall, I want them to rise, you might immediately go, oh, what do you mean? Aren't we supposed to be making housing more affordable? Of course, both major parties, both sides of politics would say, well, we don't want the housing market to crash. But talking specifically about wanting prices to rise steadily, I think that is talking not to the first home buyers, it's talking to the people who already own their homes, talking to the people who rely on homes as a bit of a nest egg, talking about growing that for their retirement. Peter Dutton, I think, was actually quite happy to be saying that yes, he didn't want house prices to go through the roof, we need to bring it back a little bit.
Well, because if you think about, you asked me for my view, and let's make this a podcast on television like we do. So the reason is so many people do own their houses. It is pretty terrifying for people if their house price looks like it's taking a slide. That's the politics here, isn't it? I mean, that's a risky thing to be telling people, that you actually don't want their house prices to be doing well.
That's right. And this has always been the hardest part of the housing crisis, is that everybody agrees that it's a problem. Everybody agrees that it's unfair to the young who can't get a leg up on the property ladder. But when you really get down to brass tacks, anything that makes housing less expensive makes it less valuable, and that pits one constituency against another. Elections have a funny way, I think, sometimes of teasing out those tension points a little bit. It's a really interesting one that's been bubbling along, as I say, for a long time in the housing debate. I think it's erupted a little bit this week. The Liberal Party are aware of the constituency they're talking to. They're talking really to the aspirational first home buyers and to the existing homeowners. They're maybe not quite so interested necessarily in the renters who are, considering perhaps voting for the Greens. They talk dismissively about the idea of being perennial renters, etc. It's a different kettle of fish there, I think, and there's a very deliberate reason why we went to Melbourne today, but we weren't really in Melbourne in a meaningful sense. We were driving through paddocks very much on the outskirts. An interesting question, though, about the kind of Australian dream that you're selling. There was an interesting moment today where Michael Sukkar pointed around. We were in Rolling Hills in Bacchus Marsh in a very new housing estate, saying this is the dream that we're selling to young Australians. But you put it into the Maps app, takes an hour to an hour and a half in peak hour traffic sometimes to drive into the city.
What that dream looks like in McEwen on Friday, and that's on our website. It's worth having a look because, in a suburb like Beveridge on the outskirts, and that's another marginal seat that Peter Dutton's pitching, there are so many structural issues with living that far away. Some of our viewers might live that far away. They would back that. Once they start living in some of these places, they say, the infrastructure's terrible, we can't get a bus, the train station's 20 minutes away. So are we doing all of the other parts of the construction, getting it right, so that we don't get people stranded in places and not having access to the broader economy?
And this is the much harder and I think the hidden cost of living conversation, right? We talk about cost of living so often in a temporary sense. 3 years of an inflation pinch, prices at the grocery store have been going up recently, but there's a broader story about economic security. What kind of lives are we setting people up for? Where are they living? How do they get to work? Do they work from home? That's another issue that's bubbled up in the campaign. And we have a situation where people who are struggling with the cost of housing, living a long way from where they work, finding it really difficult, looking to things like flexible work, looking to different arrangements, looking perhaps even at moving out to regional areas. There are lots of different ways that don't necessarily favour one particular party or another. But, you start tapping on this cost of living issue, which, it's easy to be cynical about rival handouts, but you kind of crack the coconut and it breaks open. There are some fault lines here about the kind of, the economic haves and have-nots in our society that actually, when we are having a week talking about policy, even if some people are cynical about whether either of the offerings from the major parties are any good, it does give you a chance to look in a really systemic way at this issue, and I think we're starting to have a really interesting difference between the major parties and the Greens in the way that they think about this.
I think that's right. Look, just finally, and it's not on the same topic, but it just absolutely disrupted the afternoon as a pretty significant story. This story about Russia trying to having a base basically in Indonesia. There was a story about that. Peter Dutton joined earlier and was pretty critical of Penny Wong and the government for not getting a heads up. We now have confirmation that Indonesia's not pursuing this from the Defence Minister's counterpart through Richard Marles. But that really, you must have watched that explode.
Yeah, well, explode in a very sort of short space of time. It's an interesting, it's sort of almost a flashback to week one where it felt like global events were dictating every day of the campaign trail, and it was a question of how the leaders respond. I think clearly each leader has a strategy to respond to any big global event. The Albanese strategy, perhaps you'd expect it from the incumbent, is keep calm and carry on. We're following the normal processes that we would follow. the strategy for Peter Dutton has always been he sees an opportunity to, you know, make the Prime Minister and the government he thinks look weak on these things, and so he is often inclined to go the strong path. He couches it by saying something like, look, if this plays out, it would be bad. But he's saying the sorts of things, getting on the national security turf that he feels is comfortable for him. Of course, this one's changed quickly. I'm sure he'll say it's welcome news.
Well, we'll see, actually, because there's a bit to play out and obviously more players to speak on the record. Tom, I love talking to you. Thanks, and happy... you going back, getting back on that bus?
I think so at some point. Never stops.
I remember those buses from my youth. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thanks, PK.
And let's recap some breaking news this afternoon from my colleague David Spears. Defence Minister Richard Marles has spoken to his Indonesian counterpart, who has been assured that there will be no Russian planes based there. The Indonesian Defence Minister told Mr Marles he had not received any Russian request. This does not rule out this being raised at a more junior level, but that's something that David Spears has been able to ascertain this afternoon. And of course, here on ABC News, we will continue to pursue this and all the other stories that you've heard throughout the afternoon. Well, that's it for Afternoon Briefing. We live on iView. Just search for Afternoon Briefing. Stay with us here on ABC News. Joe O'Brien is up next. Have a terrific evening.